Well, I am enormously grateful to be here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, which makes me feel old, but somehow really an extraordinary advantage to be here today. I am grateful for all of you joining us today. I'm enormously grateful for Darren and Jeff for the invitation, not just for me, but for my whole family to join us in this paradise on earth, if I may say so. It is extraordinarily beautiful. It's extraordinarily wonderful to be here. And I especially am grateful for your willingness to bring Chapel Hill weather here. And that will help explain why I'm taking off my coat now and handing it to whichever son wants to eat dinner tonight. We have a winner. I confess at the outset of being actually intimidated by the topic for today's talk, the Constitution and the future of American democracy. That's quite something. I can't wait to hear what somebody would actually have to say about that. What I will tell you at the outset of remarks about it is that I approach that big subject as somebody who really would prefer not to give a lecture. I'd rather have all of us have a conversation together, have a dialogue about it. That's going to make me a lot more comfortable and perhaps make you more comfortable as well. I don't want to be talking at you. I want to be talking with you about something we all share a love for, and that's the United States Constitution. And at the same time, I want to just share an anecdote with you following the Rosen's panel yesterday from Lawrence Rosen, telling us anecdotes, so I feel I should share one as well, especially given the introduction. Much of my professional background has been spent sort of studying clashes between Congress and the President. And when I first started teaching constitutional law, and I won't tell you when, it was a while ago, people said to me, "You are crazy to be studying that subject. The only thing you should be studying and talking about is the United States Supreme Court. That's the only real focus that you ought to have as a constitutional law professor." And not being a particularly good student, I did not listen to that, but instead was convinced and remain convinced that much of the activity, much of the significant activity, indeed much of the significant underappreciated activity that goes on in our constitutional republic happens outside of and besides the Supreme Court. In fact, it helps to shape the Supreme Court. And it may be helpful to keep that in mind. So much of what I'm going to talk about today is not going to involve the Supreme Court. So if you came to hear about that, I'm really sorry. But hopefully I can convince you there's other stuff happening besides the Supreme Court that's really important. I'm not saying the Supreme Court's not important. I want to make that very clear for the record. I know it's important. But it's not the only important institution in our republic. And it's real helpful to remember why that is the case. A good place then to start is for me to remind you, as Jeff would, that this is a good time actually to take your phones out and to use the interactive Constitution. Because we're going to be walking through the Constitution. In fact, one of my favorite quotes that I sometimes use to prepare my students for a constitutional law jog, as we're about to have, is from the movie All About Eve, when near the end, Bette Davis says, "Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride." So we're going to jog through parts of the Constitution here so that you can understand why I think the answer to the big question, what might Madison or the framers have thought about the future of American democracy, they answered in the form of the United States Constitution. That was their answer. They thought about the future. They thought about it long and hard. They reached various compromises about it. And the compromises they reached are embodied in the U.S. Constitution. So looking at the Constitution will give us an idea, not just about our past, but about the future that those framers and others, and another group of framers we'll talk about in a minute, they all wanted us to not just commit ourselves to, but to bring forward into time. So a good place to begin is with a series of clarifications, because as a law professor, I'm also obliged, besides mentioning the interactive Constitution, to mention clarifications at the outset, because they'll help us. I think actually, Lawrence's comment yesterday about, or remembrance yesterday about Harry Calvin's wonderful sort of comment that really constitutional law is about a competition for metaphors is incredibly apt. And I want to play off that as well and take advantage of it. But besides that, I think it's very important as we think about the metaphors to remember, perhaps, that constitutional law is also a language. It's like learning a foreign language. I am not bilingual, trilingual, or anything like that. But the quest here, in part, is to figure out how do we talk about constitutional law. So there's some basic notions that will be helpful to sort of we all understand really at the outset. One is just that basic notion, what's the Constitution? And we have the document itself, which purports to be the governing document for our nation's government. The governing document that defines the relationship between the federal government and the states, and the governing document that defines the relationship among the federal branches. That's helpful background. But what does it mean to have a Constitution that endures over time? Keep in mind that we didn't all get to vote on it. And yet it defines our government. It defines the framework within which we live. It is extended over time. And that written Constitution was written for a reason. It was written in part because the people that wrote it had themselves already experienced the importance of writing down constitutions. They'd done that in the form of state constitutions. They'd also done it in the form of the Articles of Confederation, which is the document that preceded the U.S. Constitution. The Articles of Confederation had been put together by the Continental Congress as a kind of weak national government that was in place before the Constitution was ever conceived, much less ratified. And it turned out that those Articles of Confederation were imperfect. And the U.S. Constitution, in some sense, is an answer to their imperfections. It's an attempt to try to address some of the problems in those articles. For example, a weak national government, a national government without a court at the apex, or without a strong or even effective chief administrator of the laws. Those are among things. And the all-powerful thing to remember, Congress's authority to regulate interstate commerce. Very fundamental notion that was put into the Constitution in part to give Congress the authority, the means by which to help bind together and perhaps establish the basis for a national economy. Something that hadn't really existed, much if at all, before the Constitution went into effect. A few other questions are going to be important to note. Why Madison? Why concern ourselves with Madison? Of course, there are a lot of different reasons. One of which is that James Madison understood something that's real important for all of us to remember. And that is, if you're in an important moment, in an important convention, somebody needs to take notes. And that insight allowed Madison to take among the more authoritative set of notes that were still a basis for trying to understand the Constitution. And of course, Madison had thought a lot about the Constitution beforehand, before the convention had begun. He'd already helped draft a plan called the Virginia Plan, which the Virginians had brought with them in the hopes of perhaps getting the whole convention to endorse. They didn't do that. Madison also came to the convention with two primary objectives. And it's perhaps somewhat surprising to know what they are. This is written about, by the way, in a wonderful book by Mary Sarah Bilder called Madison's Hand. And she talks about what Madison brought to the convention, and then she talks about how, after the convention, Madison, throughout much of the rest of his life, kept revising his notes. So something also to consider is how reliable are the notes? When did he amend them? And we should also recall there's more than one Madison. There's Madison the Framer, Madison the Secretary of State, Madison the President. I'm talking Madison the Framer. So as Madison came there, again, there were two primary objectives he had, which were important not just to him, but we'll find out throughout the entire convention. One was to ensure that there was a national government and to ensure that it was, in a sense, more important than the states. He wanted a fairly strong national government, which is really interesting for a person who later will become president and begin to distrust that very national government. The second insight that he brought to the convention was he wanted to ensure protection for slavery. Near the end of his days, Madison, I think, had begun to not just rethink that, but to recognize that may not even be a good solution for that problem. He'd recognized, this is my word, that it was a cancer, it was a problem, and he was unable to figure out the solution. And he really despaired, like a lot of people near the end of their lives at this point in time, for the future of the country, because they couldn't figure out how are we going to solve this without bloodshed, if at all. Maybe bloodshed wouldn't even solve it. So Madison's joint commitments are important for helping us understand what Madison's bringing to the table. And of course, what comes out otherwise is what we're going to look at now as the answer to a number of different questions that get asked at the convention. And as we then venture into the Constitution, I want to just mention one other big question that gets asked a lot that is useful to remember as we try and figure out the Constitution. And that, of course, is the big question of how do we read it, how do we interpret it? It doesn't come with a rule book. It doesn't come with an annotation, which would be helpful. One of my great honors is I've been asked by the Library of Congress to help coordinate the annotation for the U.S. Constitution, the official document. And I do need to get started on that at some point. No. But it's already been done. It's done every 10 years, so I'll wait till the last minute. But unfortunately, there's no handbook, rule book, and it's not even clear we'd follow the handbook, rule book, even if we had one for trying to read and interpret the Constitution. So without any kind of mechanisms, without any kind of rules, anything that binds us necessarily in the way in which we go about reading the document, as we go through it, keep in mind, there are going to be questions about, okay, how do we read these things? How do we interpret the various things we're about to touch on? Note where it begins. It begins not just with we the people, with that great opening line, which itself has become a challenge over time. We the people signals, perhaps, I think you need to be careful here, signals perhaps that we're talking about all the people. And maybe that is a small d democratic opening. It's none of those things. Of course, we the people is an important concept that we have been redefining over time. And that's going to be really helpful for all of us to remember. The we the people that spoke at the time of the Constitution framing was a smaller group of people, property, largely white, no women. And so that smaller group of people was, of course, speaking for themselves and what was becoming a country at the time and speaking for their Constitution. As we move beyond those opening words, we find ourselves looking at Article 1. You can follow this through on your interactive Constitution if you like. Now, I just want to pause on Article 1 for a moment because I think it's a very important answer, not just to the defects in the Articles of Confederation, but for the future of American democracy. First of all, the framers didn't believe in democracy. In fact, Madison, as we already quoted earlier in the week, was quite skeptical and critical of sort of pure democracy. And if you look at the way the Congress is set up in Article 1, it is not set up to maximize small d democracy. There's only one part of the federal government in the original Constitution, and it's only one half of one part of the federal government in the original Constitution that's directly elected by the people. And that's the House of Representatives. And note that the House of Representatives is incapable of doing anything by itself. You think it's just a newsworthy item right now, but in fact, it's a constitutional, it's part of the constitutional structure. There's no event that can be completed alone and by the House of Representatives. They can impeach the President of the United States, but that doesn't actually remove him from office. They can originate bills, but they can't pass bills on their own. The House, in a sense, is surrounded by other institutions which are set forth in the Constitution, which are designed in part to constrain it, to keep the small d democratic populace from overriding the rest of the government. And of course, part of the concern with small d democratic constituencies is they were prone to factions, special interests, something we don't hear about anymore at all in the United States. So in that sense, of course, the framers were prescient. They understood the world as best they could at the time. And if they weren't being democratic, we have to think about what were they trying to do in this Article 1. I think actually what you're going to see happen in Article 1 of the Constitution is that the framers are setting up a system of government that was designed to be dysfunctional. It's really hard to pass a law. Think about it. This is what you see in Article 1. It's not an accident. And by the way, as we describe the different features of the Constitution, it's also really important to understand most of these are all the product of compromise. They're not necessarily the product of absolute consensus or one mind. We sometimes say all the framers, but they didn't necessarily all agree on all the different things. They did compromise, which, by the way, is a radical concept, one that did give rise to the U.S. Constitution. But as we construe the different parts, we should keep that in mind. These are the product of a compromise that went on over the course of a hot summer in Philadelphia, where the delegates of the convention were sort of beginning to disappear over time. There were fewer at the end than there were at the beginning. Hamilton, of course, was there for a while, then he disappears. But we should also understand by the end, it's not quite as many as there were at the beginning. So it's a small group of people we're talking about ultimately are going to reach the critical compromises. Well, if it's dysfunctional, why is that? And it's partly because of a distrust in Congress, of a distrust that Congress could become too powerful, of a distrust that Congress could change the status quo. And so in a sense, the Constitution builds into it mechanisms that make changing the status quo really difficult. So passing a law requires the following. I won't sing the school rock song for you, but those of you who remember should just kind of hum it as we go through this. To begin with, it's got to pass the House of Representatives, and that means typically would go to a committee. It may make its way through a committee. Then it's got to get to the floor, and if it gets to the floor, it's got to be approved by a majority of the House. That's terrific. Now what happens? It goes to the Senate. The Senate, as originally designed, was to be chosen by the different state legislatures. And the senators, of course, each represent a state. Every state's got 2 senators. So the Senate's not designed in a democratic nature. It's designed to represent the states. And it's designed in part to be kind of a check on the House. So something gets to the Senate, what happens there? In the Senate, once again, we might go to a committee. We might get out of committee, but the way the Senate's set up under Article 1, Section 5, just like the House, it's set up pursuant to certain rules. We shouldn't forget those rules either. Those rules help determine the order of business or lack thereof in the House and the Senate. Back in the Senate, if we can get to a committee, the chair can kill something there, or it may be able to make its way through committee by a majority vote, and maybe the Senate majority leader, who represents the majority of whichever party controls the Senate, then the Senate majority leader can get it to the floor, and it may get a vote. For years, there were mechanisms that prevented votes. Those have largely, but not wholly, been done away with. There's still some mechanisms left, particularly that relate to budget matters that require votes of more than just a simple majority. And those are all done pursuant to Senate rules. Now, say we somehow get to the floor, somehow we get past those rules, somehow we get to a vote and the Senate passes it. Well, we got to make sure it fits what passed the House. If it's not the same as what passed the House, it goes back to a conference, and then they got to work it out between themselves, which doesn't always work out. If they do work something out, it's got to be passed again by both chambers, and it then goes to the President of the United States, who has the power of veto. It's really hard to override a presidential veto. That fact takes a little while for the country to understand. In time, it will become increasingly apparent that the person who wields the veto wields considerable power. And that's going to enable the president to begin to reshape the legislative process. But assume the president vetoes it. Again, override's unlikely. That means nothing happens. If the president signs it, that's not the end of the story. Because then it could still be subject to judicial review. And courts might occasionally strike laws down. Most of the time, actually, courts uphold what's done in Congress. But once in a while, they'll strike it down. And so that's quite a process to go through. What I take out of this is you should think it's a miracle if Congress ever does anything. You should think it is an incredible event that Congress actually enacted a bill, the president signed it, or it somehow otherwise becomes law. That is the extraordinary thing. Now, the effect of having gone through all that process is, again, not necessarily accidental. The effect is designed in part to ensure that if it went through all that process, it had adequate deliberation, it had some adequate consensus, and ultimately it has adequate representation across the country. This is if Congress has done something that becomes law and stays as law. Now that gets us through Article 1. By the way, there are a couple other things to note about Article 1 before we leave it. One of the things that's real important, I think, to note about the Constitution at the outset is that as we try and figure out not just the structure and what it's meant to be, we should try to also recognize that what are some of the best ways to determine constitutional meaning, back to the question of interpretation. And here's what Madison said. If the Constitution is uncertain, if the meaning of the law is uncertain, it would be, now to quote him, liquidated and ascertained by a series of particular discussions and adjudications, unquote. Madison doesn't say, let's consult what Madison said. Madison says it should be ascertained by and determined by these discussions and liquidations, which is another way of describing historical practices, how things worked in practice, which is why so often you'll hear constitutional law people talk about, well, how does it work? What's happened under this system? We're not just following Madison, we're following a traditional mode, one that's quite acceptable within our culture, of looking at the way things have worked over time as some indications of either how it's intended to work or how it's not working well. Article 1 also tells us something else, which is going to be important, I know, to this audience. It tells us that the House has the sole power to impeach, and the Senate has a special power as well that we'll hear about. It has the sole power to try impeachments. There's some question about what the meaning of impeachment is, and that brings us to Article 2. Article 2 deals with the presidency. Initially, it's hard to imagine that the people who came together in Philadelphia were aiming to put together a form of government that was overseen by a tyrant or a strong president. As my colleague Bill Marshall at the University of North Carolina says, it's hard to imagine the framers who just had overthrown a king intended to just put one back in office. And so Article 2, I think, is not designed, in spite of Hamilton's efforts, it's not designed to put a king into office. It's actually designed in part, just if we look at the design, which is a very classic way of also trying to understand the Constitution, according to the design, the presidency is defensive. It's meant in part to check congressional overreaching. It's also, of course, meant to administer the laws. Under the Articles of Confederation, actually Congress was largely in charge of administering its own laws. You can imagine how well that went. So the presidency was designed in part to provide a mechanism which the framers understood from their own states in the form of governors and others. So that was designed in part to ensure more efficient, effective government. At the same time, there was a recognition that this person who could be elected every 4 years, and there was no check on how many times this person could be elected under the original Constitution. So that's when we come to the next part of Article 2, which is of concern here today, and that is, what do we do if the president steps out of bounds? Congress, we think we've got surrounded by and large, because the president's got the veto, there's judicial review, there's this indirect electoral system. States, by the way, had a means, it was called instruction, of calling back senators who didn't do what the legislatures wanted. So those were all designed in some ways to kind of keep Congress in check. But what about this president person? How do we keep him in check? So the special mechanism is put in place called impeachment. And according to the rest of the impeachment process, besides the House having the sole power of impeachment, the Senate has the power to convict and remove by at least 2/3 vote for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, I know this is a topic of no interest to you whatsoever. But the meaning of other crimes and misdemeanors is a matter of some scholarly concern. I also don't know about you, but we don't typically, in my house, or I don't know about yours, we don't typically use the words high crimes and misdemeanors. These are not everyday language. So the question becomes, how do we figure out what those terms are? Well, we could look back at the convention, but now we need to be careful when we do that. If we look back at the convention, we should remember what we learned earlier this week. The convention was held in private. It was not supposed to be transparent. It was not supposed to be open. Nobody was really quite sure who was taking the notes. And at the same time, there was a recognition that the convention wasn't necessarily the most important event in all this. Keeping the convention more private and leak-proof, which seems superhuman to today's standards, keeping the convention that way was also designed in part to ensure a higher degree of candor and more careful deliberation, which is harder when all the spotlights are on and everybody's watching and every word gets reported in the news. So if that's not the great event, the question is, what is? And the answer was ratification, because that was the event through which the people and their representatives, through their representatives, were able to ratify the great document. So that's one reason why we also pay a lot of attention to what's said during ratification, particularly the Federalist Papers, written by three incredible figures. And we consult the Federalist Papers, which were designed in part to win secure ratification in New York. We read them religiously to try and figure out, okay, what did these people have to say about all these different things? Keep in mind it was a brief. It's a really good brief. And it's written by people who are, of course, really thoughtful and influential. But it may not talk about every issue, and it was designed to secure particular votes at a particular time. And that's important to remember as well, because when the Constitution actually went through the convention, it wasn't terribly popular in all the states. Many states were reluctant to actually endorse or ratify the Constitution because it lacked a Bill of Rights. Others had other issues with it. Later, Madison will step forward, of course, and play a very important role in proposing to add a Bill of Rights. And we're going to come back to that at the end, because that's going to change the original document in some very significant ways. But back to the question of other high crimes and misdemeanors. In the ratification debates, we are told that those fancy terms refer to abuses of power and breaches of trust. They actually come from the British common law, those terms. But because we don't all study the British common law, we can't all expect to understand what they mean today. Even if we do study the British common law, they're not going to help. And Joseph Story, in his wonderful commentaries on the Constitution, Story's later going to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States with great distinction. Story's going to write commentaries on the Constitution. And when he comes to the impeachment process, he says, look, these terms refer to what, he didn't use my name, Mike Gerhardt just referred to, but the way we're going to understand them is through practice. We're going to have to wait for Congress to act, and it will develop a kind of common law or body of experience that will then be the basis on which we can figure out what's a basis for impeachment and what's not. So looking just at the terms won't necessarily illuminate what we can look at and what we can use as a basis for removal. Now, when we move beyond Article 2 in the impeachment process, we get to everybody's favorite Article 3, the courts. Well, keep in mind, the courts are constructed by the President and the Senate. The President makes nominations. The senators either vote on them or don't vote on them. And yes, in fairly recent history, we've had instances of both those things. But under the Senate rules, there isn't necessarily an obligation for the Senate to act upon any piece of business. There's no affirmative obligation on the Senate to act upon a treaty, affirmative obligation to act upon a bill, or affirmative obligation to act upon a nomination, even to the United States Supreme Court. And again, under the rules, because the majority, by and large, controls how business is done on the floor of the Senate, just as in the House, that can include the decision not to do anything. It is an American tradition to choose to do nothing. And it's happened to Supreme Court nominations before. My guess is it will happen again. It doesn't mean that the Senate has acted unconstitutionally or illegally, but it just means that the Senate has actually followed through on the process, followed through really on the structure we've just described. This is the discretion not to act is one of the things, one of the powers it's got. When we talk about judicial review, which I won't pause on very long, keep in mind that most of the time, the United States Supreme Court, when it does take a case that involves the constitutionality of a federal law, ends up upholding the federal law. Most of the time. And the percentage is quite high, actually. If you were a betting person, you should bet. The odds are in favor of upholding a federal law. Now, critical moments occur along the 19th century, so this is a very quick class in constitutional law. I want to just mention both of these because these are going to help fill out that structure. And both of these happen when a guy named John Marshall is Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Now, John Marshall gets started with a kind of a bang of a case. That was purposeful, by the way. He gets started with a bang of a case. Those that didn't hear a bang, but anyway, yeah. So much for sound effects, right? His first case was in tandem with another case. It's called Marbury versus Madison. And then he kind of keeps going, I don't know, uphill from there or whatever, making history as the longest serving Chief Justice in American history. Marbury, for our purposes, is helpful to remind us that what happens in Marbury, among other things, is the Supreme Court says that it has the power to review the constitutionality of federal law. Okay? That takes care of half the equation. Now, the other half is, what about the power to review the constitutionality of state action? In a case in which Marshall gets conflicted out, a case called Martin versus Hunter's lessee, the Supreme Court, in an opinion by Justice Story, says the Supreme Court has that power too. Now, to show you one of the things that can happen with the Supreme Court of the United States, which is probably less common now than it used to be, is when justices came to the Supreme Court of the United States, they did come oftentimes as partisans. Sometimes they stayed that way. Sometimes they rose above it. Sometimes they found a way to work with the other side. And that's the history of constitutional law in a nutshell. John Marshall is the last, capital F, Federalist appointed to the United States Supreme Court. Most justices appointed to the Supreme Court after Marshall in his 35-year tenure were appointed to keep him in bounds. Now, I know Jeff knows the answer to this, but I'm not going to, we'll see who else does. How many dissents did John Marshall issue in a constitutional case over those 35 years? My son Noah has raised his hand. It's probably a little bit of cheating, but I'll let you answer it. He is correct. The answer is 1. Okay. He not only gets dinner, he gets breakfast, too. It's a tough household. And so you might want to think about that for a second. That is a remarkable record. And part of what that record reflects is a willingness to compromise. It wasn't always Marshall's vision that prevailed. Now, oftentimes it was. But part of Marshall's extraordinary tenure includes the ability to work with people, some of whom were put there because they were, again, put there to keep him from doing it. Now, James Madison appointed a young Harvard law professor in his early 30s to do just that. His name was Joseph Story. Madison thought, among other things, okay, this guy Story, he can handle Marshall. Well, by the end of Justice Story's career, Justice Story's idol was John Marshall. When you read the commentaries on the U.S. Constitution that Story wrote, they're dedicated to John Marshall. This did not bring great favor to Joseph Story in the circles that gave rise to his appointment, but it's a reminder that people don't necessarily all perform quite the way you would expect when they get appointed. And partly what's going on in the 19th century is that justices are performing in complex ways, sometimes predictably, sometimes not, but thanks to an initiative of Marshall as a Supreme Court, as an institution. Marshall begins, among other things, the extraordinary practice of the Supreme Court to act as an institution. Before Marshall got there, the Supreme Court issued opinions seriatim, the British style. Every justice wrote an opinion. If you wanted to figure out a case, good luck. You had to read all opinions and somehow add them up. Marshall says, no, let's speak with one voice. That alone is a remarkable moment in constitutional history, which will help bring the court to the same status and stature as the other branches. This is one of the legacies that Marshall will leave. It starts as Article 3, but it becomes a stronger article over time, in part because of Marshall, and in part because he is upholding critical federal powers that will strengthen Article 1 and help the national government become stronger over time, not necessarily more effective, but stronger over time as it related to state governments. Now, another part of the structure I just want to mention that sometimes gets overlooked, but it's an extremely important feature of the American Constitution, and that's the notion of federalism. Federalism refers to the relationship between the federal government and the states. Now, that relationship initially is sketched in the Constitution, and the states have significant authority, in a sense, as a buffer against the federal government, designed in part to keep the federal government from overreaching. And in time, the states lose power. This is a steady increment over time. The states are losing power to the federal government. It is a dynamic in American constitutional law. Part of that's the result of more and more issues coming to the federal government, seeking a federal solution rather than a statewide solution. But we shouldn't forget the importance of states and the whole scheme of the federal government, the whole scheme of the Constitution, because states are designed not just to be laboratories in places for doing things differently than the federal government would do them, but oftentimes, of course, doing things instead of the federal government. Now, I have to mention that states sometimes, of course, can be problematic. And one of the things that's happening up until the 1850s and 1860s is states largely have free rein when it comes to acting upon federal interests, particularly the Bill of Rights. So all those federal rights which are set forth in the original Bill of Rights, those apply to the federal government, not to the states. And states can do things almost at will to those interests, whatever states want to do. And one of the lessons of the bloody Civil War is that the prevailing party concludes that it can't trust states when it comes to civil rights. And hence we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which, according to their own terminology at the time, were designed to reconstruct the relationship between the federal government and the states. That's going to help transform the way the system works. There's another critical change in the structure, one I just want to mention also in passing, but this also sometimes doesn't get enough attention. I had the privilege of being, among other things, a student of Justice Scalia in his constitutional law class, which gave rise to an unusual relationship. And I saw him in one of his last public appearances, actually at the Union League in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And one of the questions we asked Justice Scalia at that time had to do with his dissents in a number of recent cases and whether or not he thought the notion of federalism still had any life left to it. And I gave him not just one, but two chances to kind of talk about that, because his initial reaction was no, just kind of flippantly said no. And I thought, no, I need to come back a second time because I want to make sure that he's got a chance in a sense to get it right for the record. Second time, he said it even more categorically. And he thought the Constitution, in a sense, was radically changed when the 17th Amendment went into effect and changed the way senators were elected. He thought that really transformed the way Congress worked. So now, instead of one chamber, we have two chambers in Congress that are popularly elected. And that meant that they could be much more, small d, democratic. And that could pose a problem because the impulse could well be to regulate, not to avoid regulation. And the impulse to regulate, of course, for Justice Scalia was not a positive impulse. It was one that he believed the Constitution had checked and provided a number of balances against. So with the 17th Amendment along with the Reconstruction Amendments, we can see how the Constitution's original structure is changing. It's becoming actually more democratic. One of the results of Reconstruction is to actually broaden the American populace, make it possible for a wider group of people, including African Americans and women, to become not just people, but citizens of the United States. That's a critical change. And it also reminds us of the importance of tomorrow's lecture that Kenji is going to give on equality, because that will, in a sense, round out our picture, round out our understanding of the Constitution as we go forth, because structure is important, but one of the most important things about structure is who gets to play. Who counts within the structure? Who gets a voice within the structure? The Constitution has given partial answers to that, but history itself and the amendments to the Constitution have helped broaden the answer to that, ensuring that the structure isn't the only check on the system. But now, of course, we're left with a dilemma. The original Constitution was not democratic, and I emphasize small d democratic. But the Constitution has changed in ways that are democratic. And that's a tremendous tension. How do we make sense of that? How do we make sense of the extraordinary conflict, if you will, between a Constitution that was designed not to be democratic and various provisions which could be construed in a way to ensure a certain level of democracy? I will not answer that question. But I'll give you a few hints about an answer. One of them has to do with interpretation, which we talked about at the beginning. Given the fact that the Constitution, in a sense, is a kind of hodgepodge of different articles, and as Sandy Levinson of the University of Texas likes to point out, imperfect in all sorts of ways, given the fact that the Constitution is that way, how then does an interpreter go about trying to make sense of any given provision? An interpreter trying to be authoritative will simply try to make sense of it based on any number of things and bring a degree of order and coherence to it that perhaps the document itself doesn't have. That's another way of saying that an interpreter has the tremendous potential to change the document. When a court or anyone else says, here's what a statute means, that is almost in effect rewriting the statute. Because now, having taught law for a lot of years, I can tell you, people will start paying a lot more attention to what people said is the interpretation rather than the original wording of the statute or the Constitution. So the interpretations take on tremendous meaning, and the great fight in American constitutional law right now, of course, as it's always been, is over the interpretation of the document. Which brings me back to where I started, the Constitution outside the court. So the Constitution outside the court reflects the extent to which there's constitutional activity outside the Supreme Court, not on the Supreme Court. That constitutional activity is an activity that all of you can be a part of. And that's significant. And the constitutional activity outside the court is not just what shapes what goes on inside those different branches, but shapes, of course, ultimately, the Supreme Court itself. The Supreme Court is a political construct. It is exactly what President Trump said it would be when he campaigned. It's exactly what the senators in the majority said it would be, and they are all answerable in different ways to different constituencies. No great surprise that it has been turning out the way it has over time, given the structure and the way power is allocated for the appointments of Supreme Court justices. Now, I will also make a brief mention of I want to return to one other aspect of the structure, because I think it is important to remember as we sort of wrestle with what the future of democracy may be, future of the democratic spirit under the Constitution may be. I would suggest not underestimating the extent to which the states are not just laboratories, but the states are places where you have, as the framers themselves pointed out, have the likeliest chance to be heard. Washington's a far way away. And I grew up in Alabama. Trust me, when I grew up in Alabama, as a Jew in Alabama in the 1960s, Washington seemed like a very far way away. And the state didn't seem particularly hospitable. And so something to remember is if the state is the place that's closest to it, it's the place where your voice is strongest, that's the place where you have to use it, the place where it's most important. I come from the great state of North Carolina, where yesterday the Board of Governors voted to close down the Center for Civil Rights at the University of North Carolina Law School. And so we are not sleeping in Chapel Hill. We are not at rest in Chapel Hill. There are values to fight for. There are values to care about, values to put forward that people can only do at that local and state level. And we are probably going to lose. This is now the second center which has been closed at the law school. They closed down a Center for Poverty, Work, and Opportunity about a year ago. They're closing the Center for Civil Rights this year. They have enacted a recurring $500,000 cut in the law school. This is not my holding out my hand to you saying, oh my God, please help us. But it is a reminder of saying that as we focus on Washington, we shouldn't ignore what's happening closer to home. The things we care about most, we have a chance to really shape and influence as best we can locally and statewide. And my hope is that next year when you get an application from me for employment, you'll be incredibly sympathetic. But rather, and on that note, let me end on a different note. And that is the reminder that the Constitution, because it's hard to change, because it's hard to amend, itself presents an interesting challenge. And that's quite, by the way, anti-democratic. There's a notion in law called entrenchment. And the problem with entrenchment is when a current majority tries to tie the hands of a future one. Generally speaking, in law, that can't happen. That does happen all the time with the U.S. Constitution. It's entrenched. And it can only be changed by an extraordinary supermajority. You need at least 3/4 of the states to agree to constitutional amendment. Good luck with that. It's not likely to happen, although a lot of people would like to see the Constitution changed. So given that stability, given the fact the Constitution is likely to endure in its present form, we have to ask the big question, which we'll get answers to not just the rest of this week, but the rest of our lives. We have to ask, what, if possible, can account for constitutional change? How do constitutional values change? What are the ways in which it can be reshaped? Every generation has to answer that question. I'm going to suggest to you the answers in the structure of the Constitution. Because the structure of the Constitution is, again, what sets up not just our lawmaking, but ultimately the relationship between the federal government and states. All that is a function of people not just voting, but of the people who occupy different offices in those different places. So the way in which the Constitution both endures but ends up being interpreted and making sense over time, and any change at all depends on people remaining involved, depends on people recognizing that the Constitution is a very short document, but if it has any vitality at all, it's the vitality you give it. I am more than happy to take questions or run. Thank you. You're all going to be on their least references, by the way, as we work through this. Not sure I'm welcome back at Chapel Hill. Anyway, but I really do want to have a conversation. Yes, sir.
Can you speak to the importance of the Electoral College today?
Yes. Yes, the question is asking me to speak to the importance of the Electoral College. So the Electoral College is another feature of that structure. in which the framers are trying to ensure that small d Democratic majorities don't make critical determinations. So the idea behind the Electoral College, besides being a compromise of sorts, was also designed to ensure the president was indirectly selected. He'd be selected by electors, and so wouldn't be immediately accountable, in a sense, to the American people. There was a distrust for popular election. And the thinking, in part, was, although I think you got to be careful when you say, attribute any kind of single motive or idea to this disparate group of people, but I think a number of people at the convention clearly didn't want most people having a say about who's going to be president. Madison's own plan in the Virginia plan had the national legislature choosing the president. That would have been a series of indirect connections between the American people and the choice of the president. We are slightly more direct now than we had been, although the Electoral College, designed in part to be a buffer between the president and the American people, also is designed, incidentally, to ensure that every state has a voice. And that becomes important to remember as well. So it's not a pure majoritarian determination, but it makes sure that every state gets heard. Every state can make a difference. When you have electoral votes going down to like one, electoral contests coming down to 1 or 2 votes, that means you've got to pay attention to every state, or at least the critical states.
Do they have a deliberative responsibility, and do they actually exercise it?
Well, I think they do up to a point, but this is also kind of an interesting question because it poses a conflict between, it really poses one of the questions that comes up a lot that we have to wrestle with, and that is, what's the function of a representative? What's a representative's obligations or duties? Just to be sort of, in a sense, a filter for the majoritarian will, or is it meant to be a fiduciary? What's the representative there to do? Vote in the best interest of his or her electorate? Electors are in an analogous position, if I can use that analogy, but I think they feel tremendous pressure to deliver what they believe the voters wanted them to do, which is to vote for the particular presidents for whose election they stood. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the importance of interpretation in terms of law. What about the effect, Justice Scalia was credited or discredited with the idea of originalism. What do you think the effect of that has been?
What the effect of originalism has been? Well, I think it's a good question. So the question is, what's been the effect of originalism, and maybe particularly Justice Scalia's brand of originalism? I think that originalism has been largely overrated. And what I mean by that, I think it's perceived as having a greater impact on Supreme Court decision-making than it actually does. A number of years ago, I did a book on the role of precedent in constitutional law. And one of the things I did in that book, and later kind of checked repeatedly ever since, is what are the different sources that justices cite as the basis for their constitutional decision-making? So what are the different sources? They could be a number of different things. One could be text, for example, the actual text of the Constitution. One could be original meaning. One could be precedent. Original meaning was at the bottom. And that was with Justice Thomas and Justice Scalia on the court. It gets cited maybe twice a term. The most common source, you can guess, is precedent. That's the lifeblood of constitutional law. That's just description. I'm not talking about values, whether or not that's the right thing or the wrong thing. But just as a description, that's how the court seems to function. Now, Justice Scalia championed the notion of trying to have the justices focus on originalism. And one of the critical questions that arose is, okay, what did he mean by originalism? And when Justice Gorsuch came on the court, he said, I think Justice Scalia understood it to mean something called original public meaning, which is actually very hard to define. But it's basically, and I could be wrong, but it's basically trying to figure out what the general member of the public would have understood this language to mean at the time that it was put into effect. Now, a couple things here, and this does harken back to our discussion earlier in the week. One is, why would justices cite that? they would cite it for a lot of different reasons, one of which is it's a way in which to try to legitimize their decision-making within our legal culture. That's a very common way of trying to do it. And so the thinking behind that is, if we've got to choose something, let's choose something we think is closely synonymous with the text. And so the people that framed it, remember ratification is real important, if the people who framed it generally understood the words to mean X or Y, then we should try and follow that understanding. The second thing to understand is maybe a more critical comment from me about that, and that is it's hard to see how originalism, even in that form, does anything other than change the text. So I'll give you an example. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution says no state shall deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. That's what it says. Justice Scalia argued that what it really meant was that the framers of the 14th Amendment wanted to outlaw racial preferences. And so for him, that's how he interpreted it over time. And he had some support for that. But the interpretation he gave does seem to be, in some sense, narrower than the language in the amendment itself. And we've got to think about how do we square that. Now, he would have said originalism is the least imperfect way of going about interpreting the Constitution. They're all imperfect, he would have said, and did say. And this is least imperfect because, again, it's closely synonymous with the text. And as lawyers, he would say, our job was to pay attention to the text and to tradition. Each of these had a particular meaning for him. And so he was trying to always stay close to that text as he saw it. And his record will be the basis on which he gets judged for that. But I think the justices who will champion original public meaning are the ones trying to sort of figure out a way to anchor the meaning of the Constitution, to immunize it from the discretion of judges. That's the great evil that Justice Scalia was trying to combat. If you can't anchor it in something principled, he would say, original public meaning, then you're licensing kind of discretion to interpret those words according to your own personal values, whatever they may be. And he thought if you had to choose, it's much better to choose the anchor than to choose to empower yourself by going out and just following your own values, which nobody, he would have said, which nobody authorized you to do. That's not your oath. That's not what your job is. And it violates, in his view, the Constitution. Now, there's disagreement on the court. There's been disagreement over the years. If you reject originalism, which some people are prone to do, you have to think about, okay, what would you replace it with? And that turns out to be a pretty hard question. Yes, sir.
How broad is the intended scope of the 27th Amendment? And clearly, the President's coma, that's took place temporarily or not, but then there's a slippery slope after that in terms of continuum of how difficult to meet responsibility, difficult or not.
Yeah, so how broadly should the 25th Amendment be interpreted? Well, it seeks to solve a problem, of course, the problem being the incapacity of the president. There was some thinking that gave rise to the 25th Amendment that impeachment, as I described it, wasn't designed to deal with incapacity. It's designed to deal with corruption. But what if the president becomes disabled or incapacitated, unable to function as president? It seems, in a sense, a little bit unfair to throw him out of office for having committed a high crime or misdemeanor over which maybe he had no control whatsoever. And so then we get the 25th Amendment, which is designed to give us a different process. Whether broadly or narrowly construed, the 25th Amendment is extremely hard to satisfy. And so one of the things that the 25th Amendment depends on is a political coalition emerging within an administration that would actually, in a sense, overthrow it, or at least declare the president incapacitated. I think that part of the idea was, okay, we want to have it in the hands of people we could trust, or not just out to kind of for political gain. We want to make sure they're being more altruistic in their decision-making. But the 25th Amendment, besides subjecting itself to some interpretation, is very hard to implement. It's hard to get all the T's crossed and the I's dotted properly. So as a result, I think we are left with a tough thing many of us here might have to accept. And that is, elections have consequences. And I think that's, believe me, look where I'm from. So But I think we can't fix a problem with an election whose outcome we didn't like through impeachment of the 25th Amendment. Not if we're going to abide by the rule of law. We've got to make sure that we're following, at least as best we can, what we think the Constitution is designed to encompass within other crimes, high crimes and misdemeanors, and the 25th Amendment, avoiding personal opinions and avoiding, a coup d'etat. And that makes it really hard. So I think no matter how you interpret it, I think that's a challenge. Yes? Yes, ma'am.
If I understand correctly, at the beginning you started with the Constitution doesn't come with a handbook.
Yes. Yes.
And then you spoke, the Senate is saying no, is constitutionally appropriate, not doing it.
Right.
Constitutionally appropriate to the Senate. And you also said that the framers of Madison thought that it would work out, how to do this would work out as we did it.
Well, the meaning would work out, yes.
And so what I'm wondering, so the court is constitutionally and traditionally constrained by precedent. But to what degree is the Senate constrained? Is there a constitutional implication for precedent in the Senate? So then saying that McConnell was refusing to bring forward, consider a Supreme Court nomination, while constitutionally appropriate to the Senate saying no is inappropriate to the constraints of precedent.
It's a great question. I say I have almost no time to answer it, but I will say that the answer is no. So the question is whether the Senate's constrained by precedent. Precedent has what we'll call persuasive value within an institution like the Senate, but that doesn't necessarily amount to very much. It doesn't bind the Senate in any kind of formal way. The Supreme Court, as Justice Thurgood Marshall pointed out, its only power was the power to persuade. So the court can even make pronouncements, but it's not clear those pronouncements will actually take effect unless they're actually supported by the other branches. I can tell you, as somebody who grew up in Alabama in the 1960s, I experienced that. I mean, I read somewhere there's a case called Brown versus Board of Education. You couldn't have been able to tell that from the way the high schools were composed. I read somewhere that prayer wasn't allowed in public school. You couldn't tell that by the way the days began. And so, they had to find us in order to be able to, implement that rule. So the court actually can speak to issues, and one of the things it's got to think about is how to expend its influence. And that, it's got limited coinage. As Justice Marshall, who understood these things, said, it's the power to persuade, and we've got to think about when is it going to be effective and when's it or possible or when's it not going to be possible. There have been times when the court has said things and it's been hard to back them up. And that is a reminder that within the constitutional order, the court can't get what it wants unless the other branches fall in line.